Labor has an emerging female voter problem. The latest research from RedBridge Group seems to suggest younger progressive women are more likely to turn their backs on Labor, and it's because of key issues like climate, handling of visas for Palestinians fleeing Gaza. For more analysis, I'm joined by RedBridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, good to see you. So take us through this research. What are people telling you in these focus groups?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, as you say, we're seeing this real issue for the Albanese government, particularly with younger progressive women. It's also there with a bit of the men, but really with the progressive women whose views of the government are really framed by two issues. They're framed by climate and they're framed by Gaza. Cost of living, housing, that's all sort of there as, background radiation. But when they think about this government specifically, what's happening is their views are being framed by those two issues. And we recently ran a poll and got some data around, whether people support or oppose the visas being offered to Palestinians fleeing Gaza. And what we found was, in the overall sense, it's quite a contested idea. You had about 30 and a little bit percent of people in support, which is the blue bars you can see there on your screen. You had about 40 and a bit percent people in opposition to that policy, and about a quarter of people undecided. But as we know now in Australian politics, overall headline figures mean nothing. You've got to look at what's happening beneath the surface there, and you can see here on this graph the swing that occurs, the real age-based sort of division really in public opinion around this, with younger cohorts, particularly those under the age of 34, being far more likely to be in favour of the support for the Palestinian refugees. And then when you put a political lens over that and you look at, well, what's happening amongst conservative versus progressive voters, and what we see is amongst Labor voters, there is strong support for offering the visas, but amongst Greens voters, there is incredibly strong support. Around 70% of Greens voters in favour of offering Palestinian refugees visas. So a couple of things going on there. One is, I think the Greens are offering a home to people that are disenchanted with Labor. And I think the Greens are very successfully elevating the issue for their voters as well. So what we're seeing then, when you get into the groups and you sort of talk to people, what's the story behind these numbers? And we find, as I say, particularly with the young women, real empathetic, compassionate response to the Gaza issue that's framing this government in opposite terms of that, uncompassionate and uncaring. And they're disenchanted, and they pile that on with the climate. They link it, in a sense, to their own economic disempowerment, which is where the cost of living and the housing stuff starts to come back to bite. And that there's a sense of almost like solidarity of people that are that are experiencing hardship, vulnerability. They see a bit of themselves in these refugees that are trying to flee a war zone, and it's really creating a very big problem for Labor on that progressive female vote that was so important to them in 22.
Okay, so how do you extrapolate this out, Simon? Because if it's, widespread and across the board, what about the concentration of these views in, vulnerable swing seats? How can you see this women problem for Labor actually translating in the electorate?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what I think we'll see is, as you mentioned, it's across the board. We're not just talking about the Brunswicks and the inner cities of suburbs of our major cities. We're seeing it in the regions, we're seeing it in the outer suburbs. I think what you'll see a lot of is, I think we'll see decent swings to the Greens in a whole bunch of seats where they're running. But aren't enough.
Where do you think? I'm thinking seats like probably Lily in Brisbane might be one of those, because there's a high proportion of renters, younger people. Are they the kinds of seats you're looking at with the Greens, or are they more obvious?
That's the ones where they will pose a real risk to Labor, where you see that sort of confluence of young people, high proportion of renters, those sorts of things. Brisbane, we know, is becoming the Greens' capital. They're doing very well in Brisbane. We expect that to continue. They have a high profile in the state. I think It's generational. It's gentrification. I think in Brisbane, it's just those voters are a little bit more concentrated than they are in the other cities where they tend to spread out a bit. And Sydney's probably a good counterexample where you have, by a quantum, of course, you're going to have a higher number of those voters. It's a bigger city. But the nature of Sydney with its property prices tends to spread out those voters a little bit more. So it becomes a bit more diffuse. Where in Brisbane is probably the most concentrated. Melbourne's sort of in between the two, and Sydney's harder going because of that diffusion effect. So I think, looking to Brisbane, looking to Melbourne, those seats, and I think what we're seeing is this across the board kind of sentiment, particularly amongst these young women, is seats like, for example, like Wills, where you always had the north sort of balancing the south of the seat, the north quite strong Labor, the south quite strong Greens. This sentiment towards the government is creeping into that middle ground. And I think seats like that, where Labor's sort of relying on a balance of demography to get it over the line, they're the ones that I'd be really worried about.
Okay, back to cost of living, just briefly. Interesting that we've seen the government at least try to separate itself a little bit from the RBA. So in this cost of living crisis, they said, inflation's coming down, the RBA is saying this, this and this. This week, and I think Jim Chalmers have made these comments before, but timing is everything. He wants the RBA to basically be slated for the blame of what people are feeling right now, right? Is that working?
There's an interesting thing going on. So one thing that is coming up in the groups a lot is people are saying, we want the government to stand up to the RBA. So there is this sort of recognition that the RBA is separate for government, but you're the government, you're in charge. You should be laying down the policies and setting the train lines. Our lives shouldn't be so dictated to by some independent body that no one seems to have control over. So, I think there's this thing in political thinking that if we outsource something to an independent body that alleviates the political pain, it absolutely doesn't. You're still the government. You're still in charge. There's still an expectation that you will do something about the pain and the hurt that's being inflicted on people.
What's your prediction, Simon, then?
For the election or for interest rates?
Election. I wouldn't ask you on interest rates.
That's good. It's I think they're both a difficult prediction. I think, look, I still think we're looking at messy. I think we're looking at minority Labor government. You know how I feel about predictions, but based on the data right now, I think we're looking at minority Labor government. I think the question is whether it's a shallow minority government where you're relying on one or two sort of independents to get you over the line, or whether it's a deep minority government where you might be relying on half a dozen, maybe even the Greens, to sort of get you over the line. I can't see in the numbers yet the Libs, the coalition, getting there, getting into a position to be able to form government. So I think we're looking at a messy minority. It's just a question of how deep it is.
I think you're right. Simon, always good to talk to you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Laura.